Hello, guys. What's up? Today we got on the guys from Maoism for the Masses, Robbie and Full Metal Maoist, here to talk about their new book. Robbie, you want to start off introducing yourself?
Yeah, my name is Robbie LeBurn, and I'm the executive editor of Maoism for the Masses and the principal author of this project, Quotations of the Modern Marxist Masses.
And then Full Metal Maoist.
Yes, my name is Jackson. I've been a Marxist for about, I want to say about since 2021. I can't give an exact full duration, but about around that point in time. I've been a Maoist for about 3 of those 4 years, and I've been about part of Maoism for the Masses for the past 3 years as well. Um, I feel we do a lot of good work, and I am very excited to discuss the book here and answer some different questions.
Nice, nice. What is the book exactly? What does it contain? And then what inspired you guys to make it?
So this book is based on the format of Quotations of Chairman Mao Zedong, or the Little Red Book, as you can see in the title. We took from that book the emphasis of having many different sections, many different types of quotes, analytical, polemical, personal, or even philosophical. Yet in contrast to that one, which had only one author, Mao Zedong, which is amazing, we have 19. They range from India to the Netherlands to Kenya. Not to be cliched here, but we really learn the value of diversity, not just in place, but also in experience. Philosophy professors, organizers, or politically conscious citizens of oppressed countries like India or Kenya could really contribute knowledge that no one else could. So we have 19 sections from dialectical materialism to neoliberalism to even socialist life advice at the end. I see online that there's a lot of summaries of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, or Marxism, Leninism out there. Well, I think they're useful. I think they can get a little dry sometimes. Goes from talking about dialectical materialism, the class struggle, scientific socialism, all the main core concepts, a brief summary, but they're only really applicable in a select number of cases where you have someone who's fully committed to learning the basics but doesn't know it yet. You don't see a lot of those types of people in the real world. In the vast majority of cases, people reach correct ideas not through being spoon fed ideas through summaries like that, but through social practice. And if it's not their own practice, other people's experiences, as we have in this book, can be a useful supplement. I think that another thing that this book does really well is touch on some difficult questions that are often ignored by the rest of the left, usually not touched upon in these intro to Marxism packages. You can really only develop a level 1 understanding of Maoism by interacting with basic theory, maybe responding to some common anti-communist myths, such that it killed 100 million people or human nature. But to develop a level 2 understanding of Maoism, an understanding that can really be applied to practice in the real world, you need to confront these challenging topics head on. So, I'd like to provide a list of the difficult questions that we address in this book, and the quotes that we may use that address them. First is that why aren't more people communist, even though it's in their clear interest to be, and the ideology is certainly true, as we believe? Why are communists losing, or at least not winning, in India, Peru, and the Philippines, when historical materialism necessitates that the masses are to seize power? Final quote in section 1, number 32, addresses that. Is the world really getting better enough when capitalism? Under capitalism, when we hear all these World Bank statistics about HDI rising and GDP going up, first quote 1.1 addresses that. And what's the difference between wanting power or wanting to change the world? It's a big debate in a lot of leftist circles. Some people accuse others of being power hungry. Some other people accuse other people of only wanting to critique power. Quote 11.5 in Communist Leaders and Thinkers addresses that. Some more questions are: is dialectics really useful? Why would the average soldier in a people's army fight? And why do people become revisionist?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the book, I haven't finished it yet, but I think it really does help people dip their toes into things. It's very wide ranging too. I think it covers a lot of good amount of topics: historical materialism, neocolonialism, revisionism, things like that. Full Metal Maoist. Is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of the book?
So yes, I feel like the book, as with the Little Red Movement, basically it gives a sort of overarching kind of examination of different concepts of Marxism, and basically kind of like it does a little bit of Q&A, kind of, and kind of shows you like, hey, if you have a particular question about this or that facet of Marxism, here's an answer or here's a quote that can help you along there. Obviously, now, obviously, of course, reading theory is a primary like a need basically in order to become a good Marxist. A lot of times you'll see people, especially beginner Marxists or level one Maoists, as Robbie has said, who will kind of avoid, not necessarily avoid, but not read theory. Though in some instances there are people who will actively avoid theory. These are mostly people who end up becoming rat libs or social democrats of the type. But theory is ultimately important, and this document can kind of give you a little bit of snippets and stuff like that from various different Marxist books, as well as some quotes that we hear of people who are Marxists and have read Marxist literature. We came to our own conclusions. So we've also given our own kind of quotes to kind of, make the book a overall comprising kind of document. And from my own personal experience, I just got done listening to Anarchism and Socialism by Stalin for the second time, and when you really listen to that type of documents, you really can kind of like if you take the time to think about it, you really can kind of link what Saddam was talking about back then in 1906 to what's going on kind of now. Even though it's like 100+ years of separation, that stuff very much is relevant. And I think we're going to get more into that when we answer the second question here. But suffice to say, I will say that this document and the quotes within are very very helpful kind of guides and basic intro to Marxism, so that hopefully you can go from being a level one Maoist to level two.
Yeah, and adding on to that,
Oh no, go
like
ahead.
using the contributions of Stalin from 1906 or the contributions of Marx from 1843 is obviously very invaluable to the communist movement today. But the communist movement of today also needs theory and information from today, not necessarily universal theories, not necessarily even guiding thoughts, but just insights from veteran communists on what's going on in the world today, how we can apply Marxism to analyze the current state of the world. Like Marx in 1843 didn't just use theories from the 1700s to complete his analysis of dialectical materialism. Obviously, his philosophy is based on old German philosophy, old English political economy, and old French socialism, but he synthesized it using the new conditions of his time to create a better world outlook, which is Marxism.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, a lot of Lenin's theories were polemical too. Like they were like very heavy critiques of like debates that aren't really that relevant to today, but theories that he got out of attacking these polemical movements were are universal. I feel like, and I think you guys are absolutely right that like we're so against like universalist no against modern day theories, and we're always focused on universalist theories, but sometimes you sort of have to focus on the modern day and like modern day issues and like polemical things in the moment, and I think a lot of people are very afraid of that. Are when you were writing this book, did you find that like there are especially like modern day issues of capitalism that haven't existed when like Marx and Mao and Stalin, they were like right, or Lenin, they're like writing during that time, that you really wanted to include in this book?
Well, I think the modern condition of capitalism is more of an intensification of past contradictions of capitalism, past imperialist aggressions, past new colonialism. There's climate change, which is a really newer development. We're only really feeling the impacts of it now. Talk about that a lot in sections 1, 9, and technology, which is 14, I believe. Yes. But other than that, like the wars going on in Ukraine, in Sudan, the genocide in Palestine, that's simply a continuation and intensification of previously existing imperialist relations.
Mm, mm. Full Metal Mouse.
Yes, I would kind of saying along the same trends that essentially with the kind of capitalism, it's not so much that it's like super changed, but more so that the things that already existed have basically been intensifying. And unfortunately, there is a bit of a trend, at least from a lot of more liberal oriented folks, where they will kind of, and this is like always going to be like a thing that people will see, is that people are so close to kind of figuring out what the exact issue is, but they won't take the next logical step. So in America, for example, the biggest issue people will highlight is Trump and how Trump is doing all these bad things. And in particular, you'll see a lot of liberals talking about how if we're under Kamala, for example, that we go back to normal or we be a bunch, failing to realize that the issues that are in capitalism are systemic. They're not tied to one individual. And that also Kamala and Joe Biden did the same, or basically had the same policies in terms of the support for Israel and stuff like that that Trump currently has. So if Kamala got in, there wouldn't be a fundamental change or anything like that from what's going on in Israel. In fact, it'd be an intensification of it more likely, just as much as it's been under Trump. So as well as the fact that with Musk back when he and Trump were kind of together more so. I think it was around around the beginning of the year more so. I know they kind of like split apart or not split apart, but they've had their little like sparring
Yeah.
match recently. But around the beginning of the part, focusing specifically on Elon Musk and kind of like the things he does are is not really it's not inherently bad to focus on those things, but becoming tunnel visioned and solely focusing on those things are, a negative. And of course, there's the whole thing about him doing the Roman salute and stuff like that. People hyper focus on that, but they don't really see the systemic issues behind that and see why they do that. They just see Elon Musk missing the forest for the trees, more or less.
Mm. I think to some extent, I've been reading up on the Russian Revolution and Tsarist autocracy. Almost every single system, I feel like it sort of becomes inbred. Especially when there's contradictions and things like that. It sort of inbreeds it in on itself, especially the elites, and you end up with these very incompetent leaders. I feel like Trump is almost sort of like capitalism's Tsar Nicholas, or at least edging close to it in that like a lot of liberals and reformers want to say like, oh, there's nothing wrong with the system, or we can just fix the system, we can just add some tweaks to the czarist system or something like that. But no, it's like the czar system itself is broken, or in this case the capitalist system.
Yeah.
um yeah,
I think that Joe
that's
Biden.
no, go ahead.
I would think that Joe Biden would be the Tsar Nicholas, like with the level of incompetence. I think Trump was like what we would have had as a response to that if the Bolsheviks hadn't taken power, of more competent, more fascist, more oppressive dictator in Russia.
That is true. I mean, I feel like both are kind of incompetent though in their own ways. No.
Yeah.
They definitely
Yeah.
both are. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
um
and
no.
this is also something I would say, like 4 years ago, like back when it was originally Biden versus Trump, like for round one, there was always this kind of hyper focus about because of how poorly Trump did, especially during 2022 in regards to COVID and stuff like that. There was always this kind of issue, and I guess we can also probably get more into that once we get to the question number two again. But the thing about how once if Biden was elected, people would kind of go to sleep and stuff like that, and you kind of see more or less how that's kind of been the same conversation we've been having recently again when it came around to Kamala and Trump. Not that any particular, and I'm saying that particular any side was correct on that, but it's just kind of like a conversation that I kind of noticed that happens twice in a row, and it probably happened maybe even before me or Robbie's time, stuff like that. But that's just something that I would like to point out as well.
Mm. I think it's obviously I think there are like slight quantitative differences between Democrats and Republicans in terms of how they rule, but I think people are unable to see that systemically a Trump is inevitable, right? Like no matter how much you vote for a quantitative change in the system, hoping that Democrats will somehow do damage control. The system of capitalism itself is accelerationist. Would you guys agree with that or not?
Yeah, I'd agree with that.
I
I
would
think that
agree.
Trump is inevitable because the system of dialectical materialism applied to politics, electoral politics, has it that when one party is in power, their failings cause the other party to come to power through elections. Like people didn't like Joe Biden. They didn't like their lives under Joe Biden, so they voted for Trump. Now people are not going to like their lives under Trump, so now they support Democrats. That's why the two-party system keeps rotating the presidency. You can't get rid of the Republicans or the Democrats forever, even if you wanted to. So that's why it's really a bankrupt solution. It's not going to do anything just voting for Democrats and then giving power back to the Republicans, even if Democrats were in the interests of the proletariat.
Or if you want to go a little bit before that, you could say, like, for example, the war on terror and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan were popular around the time. But as time went on, around 2008, it became clear that Bush was becoming more and more unpopular as support for the war became more and more unpopular. So in order to do that, they put in Obama. and then they had him again in 2012. And around 2012, people were becoming, because of how Occupy and stuff like that happened, people were becoming less and less satisfied with normalcy and wanted something different. And I think that's part of the reason. I mean, now Trump obviously is a reactionary still, point and parcel, but I think the fact that he was, or he appeared so different, was probably more likely what helped him get that presidency, assuming that elections are legitimate. What you're saying, we're just assuming elections are legitimate. That I think because he was so different than what we had before, that's kind of what inspired people to vote for him. But now, like 4 years later, around COVID, stuff like that, people are seeing that he was different in a negative way, and they want to go back to around normalcy. And that's where you had that kind of return to normal kind of kind of I guess ideology, not ideology, but that kind of mantra of return to normal around 2021, which led to Joe Biden getting elected. And then again around this point in time, people have kind of tried to make that similar argument, but in this point in time, it didn't work. So Trump got elected again. At least that's my kind of surface,
Yeah.
kind of.
Absolutely. I think one thing that liberals aren't able to see is that what they perceive as normal is already it's class warfare. Like it's absolutely untenable for most Americans, and like what they perceive as normal, most Americans would rather prefer a wrecking ball like Trump that just breaks the system, especially when they're suffering very silently. And I think Democrats, like, they kind of brush under the rug like everything that happens under this quote unquote like normalcy. Like people still get deported under Democrats. People still are poor under Democrats. People still can't afford groceries under Democrats. And so people would much rather prefer somebody who comes in and says, I'm going to break everything when you do this system of normalcy. In fact, it kind of logically sets up a Trump like figure. Moving on, though, could you explain some concepts and maybe read out some quotes from the book if you have them on hand? Could you explain some concepts such as historical materialism, dialectical materialism, revisionism, imperialism, and neocolonialism? We can go one by one. Let's see. Robbie, you want to take the first one? Historical materialism.
Middle, how about you get historical materialism? I'll take dialectical materialism.
Okay,
Yeah,
sounds
sure.
great.
So essentially, historical materialism, kind of put simply, is just applying dialectical, what we call dialectical materialism, to history, analyzing history in a way that is not, I mean, I guess, fundamentally different than the way, say, mostly liberals or more people with more idealistic or metaphysical approach would kind of examine it. So usually, this is how we get the formation of things like how the modes of production have changed throughout history. Starting from more hunter-gatherer slash primitive communism to more of a slave society to more feudalism and to what we have now, capitalism. And then, in the future, which is the biggest kind of portion of it, what is going to happen in the future? Because, and I will say this, when it comes to Marxism, really, it's not a moral thing that we want to go beyond capitalism. It is just something that is going to happen because of the trends in history, and that's what Marx and Engels originally elucidated when they were explaining historical and dialectical materialism. It's not like something, and this is something that kind of happens, and I think a bit of level one Marxists in general kind of get caught up in. They'll kind of get caught up in the, I guess, the evils, quote unquote, of the system, and kind of how its outcomes are, I guess, evil, if you want to say so. And because of that, they perceive the need for socialism as more of a moral kind of thing, when that is not necessarily the case. It is a historical thing because of trends of history that we already seen. And it's not like some sort of kind of prophecy in a way. It's not prophecy either. It's not like something you might see more along the lines of a religious or otherwise metaphysical text that says, well, this a certain event will happen at this point in time because of this Y, Z. It is because, okay, we're here, the trends of history. Here's how things have developed. Here's how multi-technology, which is the big focus. And because of how technology developed and how the productive forces have developed, this is what's going to inevitably happen as time goes on, and how the polarization of the majority of the people is a process that is ongoing and is going to continue ongoing as more and more, as like capital centralizes more. So you're gonna have the bourgeoisie who are going to consolidate more and more, and the proletarian who are going to expand more and more as a class, as well as assuming other kind of stratas of the classes like the petite bourgeoisie. And that's something that was also talked about in Anarchism and Socialism, which I just, like I said, I just listened to for a second time. So really, it all comes back around to it as well. So that's a very, very brief synopsis of historical materialism.
Right, right. It's
Yeah, I would
basically
like to add
it's basically looking at history like a scientist rather than an idealist. Robbie, go ahead.
Yeah, I would like to add on to that. That historical materialism is not historical determinism. One of our quotes from J.A. Sterling, a former organizer and contributor to Maoism for the Masses. Nothing is inevitable. That is why I mentioned the fascist vanguard. If we don't organize, agitate, educate, they will. So historical materialism really asserts that under capitalism, it sets the preconditions for a socialist revolution. It does not create the socialist revolution that must be done by conscious human action. Another quote from Section 2 by Justin Schwartz, one of our Quora friends. The arc bends, it's because people have bent it. That is why Marx insists on class struggle and revolution rather than passive development of the productive forces, bringing out a richer and more equal society.
Okay, for sure, for sure. Those are some very good quotes. Okay, moving on to the next one. What is dialectical materialism? And maybe we could break up that word into its two parts, dialectical and materialism.
That was the plan.
Okay, okay.
All right, so materialism. You're watching this and you have never heard of communism before and you're just like a liberal. Materialism is not like the tendency to like material stuff in the philosophical sense. It is an actual philosophy, and there's three basic principles of it. This is a quote from the dialectical materialism section, by the way, by me. Materialists see reality is no more than it exists. A stone falling into a puddle is the result of someone dropping it into the puddle, not some arbitrary force. 2. The universe is an objective whole, and matter exists outside of it, of a person's consciousness. Rather than matter being the product of mind, mind is the greatest product of matter. And 3, our laws can understand the objective, our minds can understand the objective laws that shape our world. We can do this through both scientific experiment and rational thought. So what happens in the universe isn't determined by some mystical force beyond our comprehension. So that's basically materialism. It's rooted in scientific experiment and perceptual knowledge instead of like mysticism and bourgeois idealism. So now on to dialectics. We actually define this pretty well in the glossary of the book to start. So we say that dialectics is the philosophical world outlook asserting interconnectedness, continuous change, and the primacy of contradictions. So what is the contradiction? Again, if you are unfamiliar with communism, that word might be a little confusing to you. Luckily, we have someone to define it, Mina Red. The definition and interpretation of a contradiction is mainly the struggle of opposite aspects with a united bond, for they are necessary to each other in order to exist. Between cold and heat or dark and light, they naturally have an internal struggle. In totality, the single contradiction has a common property of both dominant primary and a non-dominant secondary aspect. As multiple of those single contradictions collide with each other, out of power to struggle with one another. Take, for example, the form of bourgeoisie and aristocrat class, and currently the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. While contradictions can be antagonistic, as, for example, when one requires a revolution to overthrow the social systems of an oppressive class dictatorship, another contradiction is purely non-antagonistic, such as those with backward-leaning proletarians and peasants needing peaceful education to follow the socialist road. Then there is the equilibrium, achieving a balance during critical situations enacted to resolve contradictions to solve urgent crises at hand, which just might fall short of balance to be short-sighted instead and be subjected in the scientific view of the world, leading to the collapse of the equilibrium.
Okay, for sure. And then what is revisionism? I think that's a very big thing because a lot of my followers are Dungus. And so this is a very, I think, like contentious topic, especially amongst the modern day left. So I'm interested to hear what you guys have to say about that.
Okay, so basically, when it comes to revisionism, quite frankly, it is just the revision or revising of Marxist text or Marxist ideas. Very simply, from my knowledge, the first major revisionist was Edward Bernstein. I believe he was around during. Let me cite my sources here. I believe it was before World War One, but let me make sure here.
He was around World War One. Yeah, he was a major figure in the German left. Lenin and him went back and forth a lot. So you can say like World War One ish before
Yes.
one.
because Lenin himself, who was more dedicated to Marxism, had his various critiques of the First International and not First, sorry, the Second International. I keep getting those two mixed up, but we can edit that part out. But yes, he essentially had his major critiques of Bernsteinian philosophy, and a big part of that was the fact that essentially, and this is also kind of what's kind of going on, but revisionism as a trend is quite dangerous. I mean, me and Robbie both agree. It is quite dangerous. It, in fact, has led to the undoing and the housing of not only socialist progress, but in the whole, but also the, I guess you could say, ruination of many lives. If you want the biggest example, the Soviet Union, its dissolution, because it wasn't about. I mean, it didn't collapse, which is what a lot of people say it actually was dissolved undemocratically by the likes of Yeltsin and others. And part of that reason was because of the revisionism of Gorbachev and of Brezhnev and of starting with Khrushchev. How the essentially the revising of Marxist principles, the abandonment of Marxist principles for more capitalistic involvement has kind of undone that. And I know you said your audience is on more Dengist, but unfortunately, like, when it comes to Dengism, it also has led to worse outcomes, especially in China, particularly. I know a growing trend of, and it's not like a growing trend, but it's like a major trend of revisionism in Marxist circles internationally is about how support for China and support for revisionism. But suffice it to say, individuals like Deng Xiaoping in his approximations, his opinions on Marxism were incorrect. Mao himself critiqued Deng many times when he was still alive, and Deng's policies, as we can see in the immediate aftermath of Mao's death and the kind of transition of China from a communist-led country more towards the lines of capitalist imperialism that we see today. A lot of those policies are a result of Deng Xiaoping's own lack of understanding of Marxism and his own kind of like negative, or not negative, but his own kind of, like I said, mainly lack of understanding of Marxism. And that's also one thing with revisionism as well. Sometimes it can take the form of simple misunderstanding, but also it can also take often the like a actual deliberate attempt to revise Marxism for purposes of either discrediting it or trying to run the movement into the ground essentially. So, you might have like either federal or other like state actors on behalf of capitalism attempting to distort Marxism for the purposes of purposely derailing the movement, or sometimes the revisionism can come as a form of a lack of understanding of Marxism from an individual. So it can take multiple forms, but suffice to say, revisionism is the probably what I would say, and maybe Robbie might agree with this, the second biggest issue when it comes to a lot of more modern communist parties, not only in America but in other countries, like for example the Communist Party of Great Britain, the CPI Marxists, for example, that's the Communist Party of India Marxists, as opposed to the CPI Maoists. A lot of these organizations do end up revisionist. They end up supporting bourgeois parties, especially in the case of organizations like the CPUSA, which did and still has, I believe, called for support of the Democrats during electoral cycles, just like that, citing this kind of fear mongering about the not fear mongering, but like kind of overplaying the role of the likes of Trump and others in the rise of fascism in the country. Something that we talked about a little bit earlier, kind of hyper focusing on that. So those type of trends, those all can kind of be umbrellaed under revisionism. Robbie, would you have anything to say?
Yeah, so saving like the talk about modern China and its role in the global international system for another day, I'd like to talk about the errors of the methodology, the theoretical methods of revisionism. So we got the quote in the revisionism section by Mina. Revisionism is only dogmatic tailism in that it does not seek an evolution of the Marxist science. Unlike the work of great synthesizers like Marx and Stalin or the revolutionary internationalist movement in the 80s, it blatantly attempts to devolve any sort of political analysis of class struggle in the role of dialectical materialism. It often even denies labor theory of value, reverting socialism to its utopian root with no aim of capitalist dissolution. Take Khrushchev's doctrine about the state of the whole people or party of the whole people, which dilutes any evident necessity for proletarian dictatorship since class struggle is resolved with the triumph of the proletariat. This form of thinking is dangerous as it crouches behind some revolutionary phrase-mongering, slogans, and red banners deceptive to the masses as intended. It gradually evaporates socialist principle to the rightist environment. So leaving aside whether the question of whether China is like a progressive force in destabilizing US imperialism, people who support China with the logic that, oh, it is growing the economy, oh, it is um
Eradicating poverty.
yeah,
Yeah,
oh,
and I hear
it's
that.
just like making the numbers go up, oh, it's um fighting the US, oh, it's criticizing liberals. Like
Or
those are
separate block.
signs that somebody is doing the right thing, but it's not proof that they are a historically progressive force. It's not a replacement for a theoretical and Marxist analysis, which may be hard to come by in a short period of time, but it's really necessary for any
Mhm.
practice to succeed.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I would be inclined to agree. I mean, especially that point about just because numbers go up doesn't mean necessarily that it's a historical progressive force, or that it's necessarily a new system. Like for example, Alexander II destroyed serfdom in Russia, but he was still a czar. It was still czarism. And capitalism can lift people out of poverty. I mean, extreme poverty at the very least. It can still be capitalism, though. Even if it does lift people out of it, which extreme poverty is always defined very funny under capitalism, anyways. Um, yeah, one thing I find very fascinating though is the question between what's the difference between revisionism and pragmatism? Because like to some extent, almost every single philosopher or theoretician after Marx, to some extent, was a little bit of a revisionist in that they did tweak Marx and Engels theories for more of a pragmatism, right? Stalin, for example. Stalin, for example, put forward the need for a more pragmatic solution. Even though he still adhered to keeping it close to the original text as possible. Mao's also very similar. So what would you say is the major difference between revisionism and pragmatism?
Well, Stalin and Mao adhered to the foundations of Marxism, the class struggle, dialectical
Mm,
materialism. In fact, they even expanded on these principles and like filled in gaps that were present in previous work. Modern revisionism, as seen in Khrushchev and Deng, from what I've seen, tries to discard class struggle, doesn't really put an emphasis on dialectical materialism, rehabilitates Confucius. And while there has been a resurgence of sympathy for Mao and Marx in modern China, I'm not entirely sure if this sympathy has extended to their actual theories or just the image of the person.
So basically, it will dilute Marxism more or less. It'll render it something more of a parody of itself.
right, right. Yeah, of course. Class struggle, I think, is proximate. It's the very foundation of Marxism. You can't get past that. Uh, what about imperialism and neocolonialism? We'll just do a double whammy since they are similar-ish concepts.
All right, you can take imperialism. I'll take neocolonialism.
Yes, give me 1 second. Yeah. So I got that. Get the book up here. Okay. So imperialism, more broadly, excuse me, is essentially, and this is going to kind of sound pretty weird because I mean myself, I still have to kind of get my deep dive into it, but essentially, imperialism. See, I'm trying to figure out words to kind of describe this because I'm not the best narrator, kind of. Essentially, Lenin's theory of imperialism kind of shows or kind of explains to us the developments and underdevelopment of country-to-country relations between countries. So, for example, I'm going to give a brief, I guess, kind of example here. The most classic example many probably would think of is American imperialism in Latin as well as in the Middle East. So, in countries like, say, Iraq, Afghanistan, or places um, they attempted Cuba, but not really Cuba, but other places such as in um, Brazil and in well, not Brazil, but so the basic definition: imperialism is the final stage of monopoly capitalism. It is characterized by a couple different characterizations. So one, the concentration, excuse me, of capital into a smaller number of monopoly firms. So in a real life example for this. if you were a person who drinks soft drinks, for example, go look at those soft drinks and look at the back of the soft drink and look at the manufacturers. Oftentimes, the biggest two ones are Coke and Pepsi. Those are the two biggest manufacturers of soft drinks, for example. Or if you want to use your hygiene products, look at the back of your hygiene products. The more normally is I believe Colgate or Palmolive. Companies that were first kind of separated at first, like there are different companies, but they have kind of congealed and monopolized into it. So, for example, the gas industry, for example, I believe there's other companies like ExxonMobil, BP, Speedway, they all kind of like fall under the umbrella, I believe, Ford Incorporated, for example, in the gas industry. So just generally, what this means kind of is just like during Marx and Engels' time, there was a lot wide plethora, sorry, of different companies and manufacturers kind of competing for commerce. But as time has gone on, these companies have kind of congealed, merged, or kind of melded into bigger firms, stuff like that. So as time has kind of gone on, you see more and more of certain companies basically everywhere, and smaller businesses and like have either been pretty much produced that has been a history, or have been merged into those bigger companies and have now become part of it. Number two, the merging of industrial and bank capital into finance capital. Number three, the export capital rather than commodities to peripheral countries. So, if you want to go back to China, for example, if you look at their involvement in various African countries like Zimbabwe, they typically don't export just like commodities. Like they don't just export products there; they export actual capital and resources to there to build them up, so that way they can have them in their sphere of influence under BRICS, which is kind of like a competing imperialist organization to NATO broadly. So that's kind of a way, and that's kind of gets more into social imperialism, which we'll get into in a little bit here. Number four, the emergence of trusts, cartels, and syndicates. And number five, and that's probably the biggest one, the territorial division of the world into colonies, semi-colonies, and imperialist countries and non-imperialist countries. So typically people will use language of like global north or global south, but we can these definitions are somewhat helpful, but sometimes they're a little bit more vague. We tend to, like I said, prefer imperialized countries and as well as colonies and not and colonizers. So, for example, the various big like imperialist countries, like for example, the bloc of the Nordic countries in like Sweden, Norway, Denmark. These are all imperialist countries. Canada, UK, both imperialist countries. UK, imperialist country. This is for example, and then there's also various colonized countries. So, for example, a good portion of Africa, for example, good portions of South America, like I said earlier, as well as in other parts of Asia, like especially South Asia. Essentially, it is kind of to explain, or it kind of explains how the division of the world and how the relations between countries has changed fundamentally from what Marx and Engels were like. Because, like you said earlier, Lenin did kind of update Marxism because their things were different around his time during the late like late 1800s to early 1900s than they were when Marx and Engels were primarily active, during the mid 1840s to beyond.
Right.
And up, so that kind of so imperialism broadly kind of explains those relations. It kind of explains how countries kind of relate to each other now as compared to what was back then. And I think Robbie will kind of explain it to neo-colonialism, which is like the latest form of imperialism, or like I guess the highest stage of imperialism. Like you said, much like how imperialism itself is the highest stage of capitalism.
Exactly. So yeah, neocolonialism is the highest stage of imperialism, as said by Kwame Nkrumah, a Ghanaian, the former president of Ghana, who was couped by the CIA. It relies on the economic exploitation of a country's labor and resources while not having political sovereignty over it. There are very few, like relatively few, explicit colonies or territories left in the oppressed country today. Most of it is neocolonies. And multiple imperialist nations can exploit a particular neocolonial nation at the same time. So it's not a one-to-one thing. The U.S. exploits the Congo while China exploits Zimbabwe. Both of them can exploit both of them at the same time. And it's reinforced through both hard and soft power on behalf of the imperialists. Hard power is like military force, so like the invasions of Iraq and Afghanistan. Why did I say it the Yankee way? And soft power, like the force of the intelligence agency, CIA, and like cultural influence, as well. So neocolonialism can lead to some of the difficult questions I talked about earlier. The level one Maoist understanding is that the only form of neocolonialism is direct foreign investment, when corporations from a imperialist country directly invest or set up factories or production in oppressed countries. And that understanding, I think, is problematic because it leads you to the incorrect conclusion that people in oppressed countries who don't work for foreign-owned firms aren't actually exploited by imperialism. There's only, like, I think 70 million people who work for multinational corporations in the oppressed countries. But in reality, there are many, many forms in which imperialist nations exert economic hegemony. Some of these ways are debt contracts, structural adjustment programs, IMF loans, currency hegemony, and unfair trade deals. Furthermore, going back to the principle of a capitalist rate of profit, you have the division of imperialist super profits between different corporations in imperialist countries. I'm going to quote a book called Fundamentals of Political Economy. Not Quotations of the Modern Marxist Masses. It's a different book. The formation of an average profit further conceals the capitalist-exploitive relationship. The transformation of surplus value into profit already confuses the source of surplus value. So the formation of an average rate of profit is a theory that goes back to the time of Marx. When you apply it to imperialism, it says that a corporation like Glencore, which if you don't know, is the company that runs a lot of mines in countries like the Congo or Chile, and often attracts human rights scrutiny for child labor. If it obtains profits at the same base rate it obtains profits at the same rate that other companies do. This is because if industries that employ more human labor with a higher organic concentration of capital, the source of all value, if they made more profit, more capitalists would invest in them, causing an imbalance in supply and demand, returning to the equilibrium of the average rate of profit. The super profits that Glencore would get off of cobalt mine use and child labor are in fact distributed throughout the entire economy of an imperialist country. If they price their minerals too high at the value of the labor required to produce them, other companies would mine more cobalt and put more of it on the market, leading to an abundance of supply, so much that it would lose value. So with cheaper sources, undervalued cobalt and raw materials, companies that rely on Glencore as a supplier, from Tesla to Apple, can get bigger profits in return. And this is tied to the exploitation conducted by Glencore in the third world.
Yeah, one interesting thing I've found throughout this discussion is how capitalism hasn't really changed. It's just sort of become more hidden. Like it went from like imperialism to neocolonialism, which, as you mentioned, is very less hard to see directly, right? That direct colonial occupation. And then of course, in many other ways too. Um, would you say that is sort of unique to modern day neoliberalism at the very least? Like capitalism is harder to see its direct effects, or it's behind a curtain, or would you say it hasn't changed whatsoever, like since the Gilded Age, and it's always been like this?
I think that, yeah, you're right. It's much harder to see its direct effects. And furthermore, in the context of determining who is an ally, who is a net exploiter, who is the labor aristocracy, who is not, you have to think about the principles of neocolonialism in exploiting the global south. Because as like I said previously, a manager at Tesla, at first glance, it appears that they don't directly benefit from the child labor in the Congo. But when you think from a level 2 Maoist perspective, thinking about the theories of political economy that create the economic basis for a company like Tesla, you learn that, oh, actually, maybe they do make some money from child labor in the Congo.
And this is also another thing as well, that when it comes to imperialism, a lot of the time it is obfuscated because people think imperialism, like you said earlier, solely comprised of hard military invasion, or when one big country does one thing to another country, kind of. So some people will even say that the Soviet Union was imperialist, not because it was not pointing at the social imperialism, but just because they will say, okay, well, the Soviet Union, for example, during its formation, let's say, had Ukraine part of it, or founded Ukraine, or did this to a country, and they'll kind of obfuscate the actual political economy behind it, and more so focus on the very surface level interpretation. This is mostly what liberals do, and this is why the understanding of imperialism, as it is broadly from 99% of people, is incorrect. And this is where we as Marxists have to kind of define our terms, or we make a point to define our terms, so that way people actually understand what is going on. And then when it comes to colonialism, because of neocolonialism and how it kind of can kind of obfuscate things, that also makes it to where people kind of don't understand how colonialism works, because they think of, when people think of colonialism, they will just primarily think of, let's say, for example, like the English Empire, having territory in like India and other countries, for example, or other places where now more modern countries kind of exist, or they'll think primarily of, let's say, Imperial Japan, and they won't kind of factor in neocolonialism and how that actually is a form of colonialism, just of a not a different character, but just like it appears different, and they won't do that kind of investigation required to kind of understand that. So that also can be kind of an issue sometimes when it comes to introducing newer people into Marxism, or having people just generally understand, more Marxism in general.
Yeah.
Yeah, and adding on to your analysis of like the wrong liberal definition of imperialism, it's not just a definition adopted by liberals, it's also adopted by some communists who don't do reading. I remember that we had a guy, Comrade Mall, in our organization who, like, 6 months into joining, still repeated, oh, imperialism is when one country exerts hegemony over another. And he didn't really like change his idea when exposed to Marxist theory. I think that that's something really important to have a concrete understanding of the state of the world today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think imperialism is such a tentative concept amongst the left. Everybody talks about it, and yet there's not really a formal definition that anybody can really agree on. And a lot of the left does sort of have that definition that you were talking about that completely ignores the political economy side of imperialism, I feel like, and it focuses solely on a more aesthetic aspect of imperialism. And it's just like big country takes over small country, or a big country does military action in small country, and it really obfuscates a deeper delve into what imperialism could be, much deeper than say that. um and you'll get up with like sometimes like goofy conclusions, like, oh, the Soviet Union was imperialist for going to war with Finland or something of that sort, rather than an actual like, deeper analysis that looks at, okay, who, what are the relations of production here, where is the money going, where's the capital going, which direction is it going, and which direction is it being invested in, who's being exploited, what labor is being exploited, things like that. And I think the modern day left is very confused and unable to do that deeper level analysis that only Marxism can give you. Um, Moving on. Oh, would you argue that Maoism is a distinct ideology from Marxist-Leninism, or an extension of it? Recently we had on, well, it's been a while, but we had on Andrew Smith, who wrote a book about Maoism in Eastern Europe. And a lot of those groups, they call themselves actually Marxist-Leninist. It was in response to Khrushchevite reforms. And so a lot of early Maoists actually, in fact, call themselves Marxist-Leninists. So what would you say is the big distinction?
Okay, so Maoism is distinct from Leninism insofar as a higher development. It has theories within it, within its body, kind of, that Leninism didn't have because of the time and place. Not to say that Lenin was like an idiot, or like Lenin didn't know, but just that as kind of things have gone on, newer, I guess, not synthesis, but newer tactics, ideas, and concepts have kind of came into Maoism. For example, a big one, for example, this is kind of like the biggest one, the fact that class struggle continues under socialism. This is a very big contribution and foresight that Mao saw during the stage of socialism that unfortunately Stalin did not. Not to say that Stalin, like I said, was incorrect or something like that, but just that, at the time and place, it seemed like, as the Soviet Union was developing, that, okay, we have the social revolution, we were going 30 years strong in terms of developing socialism after ending the NEP and developing the 5-year plans. But slowly but surely, revisionism unfortunately crept up into the Soviet Union. And by the time of the late 50s, after Stalin's death, that's when we get the likes of Khrushchev, which eventually came into the like of course, Brezhnev, and then Gorbachev, ultimately ending up in the Soviet Union's dissolution. So part of Maoism, and the reason why we say Maoism is very important, is because we have the foresight now of seeing the mistakes that were made during the time of Marxism and Leninism, and part of those lessons that we learn, we incorporate into Maoism, and this is what Mao did during his time frame in China, such as launching things such as the Great Cultural Revolution, which was supposed to be, and which was actually an attempt to remove reactionary elements of Chinese society and a capitalist society from the then socialist kind of society, because one of the things that most Marxists know and understand about Marxism is that just because we have the social revolution does not mean that capitalism is completely gone. There are still elements of capitalism that still kind of exist and permeate within socialism that have to be actively combated. It is not a passive thing. It has to be something that has to be done actively, consciously, and that is something that Robbie explained as well when it comes to historical materialism. Just because we understand how things are going to go, are going to happen out when it comes to socialism, doesn't mean we can sit idly by and let that kind of happen. We have to be active and proactive in our approach to it. And that is a big thing about Maoism, and that's why it has so many different concepts and developments from Leninism that makes it a separate and final, not a final, but separate stage.
Right.
That was everything I was going to add. I think that was a really great explanation.
Okay. Okay. Nice. Nice. Yeah. No. I mean, I like that you said it's not the final stage. Like theory can always evolve. It's likely never going to end. It's a never ending process. Yeah. That focus on a class struggle existing after socialism and the constant need to combat it. I find very interesting and very refreshing about Maoism. Whereas like a lot of ideologies think that, once you get to socialism, it's just a clean, easy break, and you can just it automatically cleanly transitions to the next system rather than it being messy. I mean, like all human revolutions and transformations are essentially very messy. I mean, there's no easy, clean break from one system to another. There's always this gray area as we're transitioning economies, especially from collective private ownership to collective ownership. um Moving on, I think one of the most pressing issues for most Marxists is the genocide in Palestine. Considering that there's many interpretations of it, some Marxists completely reject the nation state itself and say, we shouldn't support Palestinians or Israelis. We should just support the proletariat. What do you think the correct Marxist approach should be to Palestine?
So first and foremost, all communists must do what they can to stop the genocide, regardless of blah 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 nations say blah 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 Palestine doesn't exist. Just there's genocide going on and it needs to be stopped. Not supporting nationalism in this context is frankly idiotic and a result of looking at your phone too much, not interacting with the real world. But to criticize that position, you first have to understand it. We have observed a lot of people, some of which in our own server, who say things like Palestine would have our support if they were not a bunch of religious zealots. That position stems from both true inhumanity, failing to recognize Palestinians as humans or equals to people in advanced capitalist countries, but also the belief they are a reactionary group trying to bring back the caliphate, as in the case of like the belief that Hamas is reactionary and trying to bring back the caliphate, as ISIS does. And to contradict that, a Palestinian contributor wrote to our book, Hamas has more women's representation on their central committee than some communist groups even. It's genuinely just Islamophobia, where these people think that all Muslim women are living in slavery conditions. So first and foremost, that belief that like the Middle East is so backwards and that Islam is a fundamentally reactionary, oppressive ideology needs to be combated with truth and reality in order to get some of these badly mistaken people to support Palestine.
Yes, and then I will also add that, like, I know we as Marxists, of course, we have our critiques of religion and organized religion, but at the same time, we should not be dispelling liberal myths about the Middle East and of Islam as a whole. I do feel that a good portion of these kind of tendency to have these negative opinions of Hamas and of Islam as a whole are from people who haven't fully shaken off the decades of liberal propaganda, especially ever since 9/11 has happened. They haven't fully shaken that belief belief off. And this just isn't something limited to Palestine as well. It's something that happens like generally when it comes to different topics. Just because you're a Marxist doesn't mean you fully or proclaim you're a Marxist doesn't mean you fully and completely break away from different, kind of beliefs, and that's how things like revisionism can kind of happen. But in this particular instance, like I said, I do believe that those kind of backwards or more backwards opinions on the Gaza situation do come from people who haven't fully shaken those beliefs off yet. And we as Marxists should be supporting Palestine, of course, calling support for end the genocide. As a personal note, me on Twitter, I've seen like various like lots and lots of photos, videos, and other documentation of the genocide and its brutality. And this is something that we as Marxists should all be giving unilateral and unanimous support to the Palestinian movement because it's quite a brutal situation.
Yeah. Going back to the book for one final addition to this section, got a quote in section 8, Revisionism, by an Egyptian contributor named Omar. If you went and told the masses that your lives are numbers on a sheet to me, they will beat you down on the very ground in which you said that. If their lives don't matter to you, neither would yours to them. We already know that communists won't stop at arbitrary standards to start a revolution. That is how it was for the most of history. Saying these things is not going to list you as smart or pragmatic. It's just being a fool, or more plainly, being foolishly bold. Why would the masses support someone who doesn't even think about them? Many workers in your position are conservatives, and they should be given political consciousness and educated by the mass line because they currently lack it. When they start sharing the same wrath to the bourgeoisie, their coercive forces in their state, that is when you will educate them that is in fact the bourgeoisie who is expendable.
Absolutely. I find that quote very poignant. And yeah, no, I think a lot of communists are afraid of things like land back, the Palestine movement, and it really partly, I think it is shedding a bit of Western chauvinism, things like that, and also just a very bad reading of Marx itself, like a very mechanical reading. I think Robbie was right when he said, or when they said, you need to look up from your phone a little bit and just put your head into the real world. I was wondering if you guys have heard of Palestinian Jihad. It was actually a group of Maoists that did mass line in Palestine, and they realized that Islam was a very big part of Palestinian life, and so they actually adopted jihad in Islam into their organizing. I was curious if you guys have ever heard of that group.
I have not, but it does.
I've heard of PFLP.
Yeah, I heard of
PFLP, yeah.
and the PFLP and the DFLP. So that's something though that I'll probably look into more so after the end of this podcast because it does seem kind of interesting there. I will also just give one more comment real quick just on this. I have a quote that we put in the book as well. It goes, and this one I made myself. It is bourgeois morality is the furnace in which the oppressed of the world suffer within. I do feel that this is true and very much is a fact of life when it comes to how liberals kind of think and approach these movements because oftentimes like I said, because Hamas is not 100% clean or something like that, because these things are not always clean, they will always usually be the first ones to condemn a movement, especially of a movement that is essentially oppressed people fighting back against the oppressors. They'll be the first ones to condemn these movements based off the fact that they're not 100% pure. This can, kind of go more to like the arguments of authoritarian versus, totalitarian and other kind of concepts like that. But essentially, I do feel truly that a big thing about these movements, not just limited to Palestine as well, but just also generally in a historical context, is that because these things are not clean, as you said, they often will have condemnation. And I think we as Marxists should be better in terms of our analysis. Like we shouldn't be stooping down to liberal thought processes when it comes to these subjects, because quite frankly, like I said, there is a genocide. Hamas is an organization that only exists because of the Israeli genocide of Palestinians. It is not something that just came about just because. So, and we need to be better about how we approach things than your typical liberal. And we need to also educate where we can as well to kind of get people out of that mindset and get people to understand why we support, Gaza and Palestine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hamas is also very often portrayed, I think, as like a crazy Islamic fundamentalist group, but they're very reasonable actually if you study them. They have a very democratic election process internally and within their Politburo and everything. Or I'm not sure exactly what their internal organization is called, but they have a very democratic process. They've offered to, in fact, dissolve themselves for democratic state within Palestine where they're not the ruling party, they would dissolve themselves. They've offered to turn in members who to committed crimes, quote unquote, during October 7th. Anybody who was did any war crimes, they've offered to turn them in. And so I think the condemnation of them as this crazy Islamic group, especially compared to the bourgeois Israeli and American side, is crazy. I mean, it's almost night and day, their leadership and the other side. Go ahead, Robbie.
Yeah, I think Middle and I pointed out like two ends of like two extremes. I pointed out people who say, "Oh, I don't care how many people die," who are bad. He pointed out people who say, "Oh, no one has to die, or you're a revisionist." I think that like the correct opinion is not it's not a middle ground fallacy, but the correct opinion is in the middle. Like some people, yes, it's inevitable that some people are going to suffer, some people are going to die in the course of any meaningful political action. Yet we must be sympathetic to the masses and ensure that this suffering is limited, because really the point of like communism is to end global suffering, not to intensify it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And there is no bloodless revolution. I mean, all political change has to happen through violence.
And yes, this is where that the first part of my quote, bourgeois morality, kind of comes into play, because I do believe we as society, under liberalism, have kind of become so hyper focused on morality and good being good, that anytime there is any sort of bloodshed or something like that, liberals will immediately condemn it and say, "Oh, well, it's bad," stuff like that. They don't realize that their own system that they supported came from violence. Like the break from feudalism into capitalism was not entirely bloodless. Like there are places like the American Revolution against the British, the French Revolution. These things were very bloody and violent. But yet we don't see these same liberals saying that or sometimes they will, but generally we don't see liberals mass condemning these type of things. They usually will just give this a blind eye, and it's only typically when communists or other oppressed people try to rebel. That's certainly when we gotta be super moral, and we're bad people if we support them and stuff like that. So that's just a tendency that I observed, which led me to kind of formulate that quote.
Absolutely. And of course, they never mentioned that their system is so violent. I mean, there's violence is just normalized, though, right? Their violence. If Israel strikes Palestine 100 times, even before October 7th, it was the deadliest year for Palestinian children, and Palestinians in general. But that was completely normalized within the news. I mean, violence from top down is always okay under liberalism, but violence from bottom up is the worst thing on earth.
Yep.
In
And they were
every
off.
single facet.
And they'll also often they'll use language that soften the blow. Like they'll say, like if the Israelis kill a child, for example, they'll say, child killed as Israeli, I guess, airstrikes a certain area, or like they'll make it seem like it's accident. But if Hamas were ever to do something like that, they would say Hamas guns down innocent Israeli citizens,
Mm,
for example. So you gotta pay attention to the language that you guys use, and you'll really see the dichotomy that's presented.
yeah. Yeah. Moving on, where will socialist revolution take place first? Of course, could you explain what third worldism is? Do you guys agree with it? Will it most likely happen in the imperialized countries? As you said, obviously, you guys prefer that term over the global south. I've gotten shit for saying that most likely it'll happen in the global south myself, especially from trots who have said like, oh, no, 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 it has to happen in the global north also at the same time, or it will happen in the global north. But I do you feel as though the contradictions are more poignant in the global south, where it makes it more likely to happen there first?
Yeah, yes. The countries that have been the most oppressed by imperialism are most likely to have a communist revolution. We have a principle in Maoism, new democracy, and a united front that addresses the supposed inability of a country that doesn't have developed capitalism to have a socialist or people's revolution. We don't have the socialist revolution, so we've established new democracy. What we're really looking at in the global south is new democratic revolutions aimed at overthrowing imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucratic capitalism, which have been successful in the past and are currently some of the only revolutionary wars being fought right now. So to think that the first world, with a higher proportion of the working class not really having an interest to dismantle the system, that's just like kind of silly. The whole proletariat, even some of the bourgeoisie in these oppressed countries, has it in their interest to take down imperialism and establish new democracy. It's just much more feasible in those countries than it is in the United States, Western Europe, and Japan.
Mm. Mm. Because that goes to the economic incentives, because the proletariat of the global north, to some extent, some of them, especially the labor aristocrats, have a stake in the system, at least for a little bit, until they don't anymore. Um, Especially, I feel like commodities are such a big part of it. Like in America, we might not have healthcare, but I can go down to Walmart and get like 20 trinkets like immediately. And it kind of softens the blow of capitalism. And, these trinkets are made by like child labor in like the global south. And I don't know, it almost makes it, it almost incentivizes workers here to keep those children working. I mean, the global southerners working in the subservient position. Or, do you agree with that or do you disagree with that?
One thing I would say, I know Robbie probably has comments, but one thing I would say is I think a big thing about it, and like the way we're attracted is by escapism, like with media we present. And I think that though, me personally, as a Marxist, I feel like escapism is only going to work so far. Like at a certain point in time, as media, because a lot of media, like movies, games, stuff like that, they're kind of telling the same stories and so many stories over and over, and eventually it's going to become to a point where people maybe are going to be looking at it like maybe this isn't working. And then once people's kind of like tunnel vision or like once basically the blinders are taken off from escapism, people are gonna realize, wow, my life really does kind of suck. Like things are not on the up and up. And even with escapism still in play, people still do kind of recognize those issues. It's just that it oftentimes is framed in a not in a bad way, but a way that's not helpful. So the biggest way people tend to frame it, especially liberals, is more like the elites, like they point to the elites as like a very nebulous class of people when they don't use a concise concise terminology that we as Marxists use, which of course would be bourgeoisie versus proletariat, for example. Or sometimes they'll highlight how, like for example, like the price of eggs, for example, was like astronomically high recently. Like they'll point out like how and how wages and stuff like that are not increasing or at parity, and that these issues are very much prevalent, but they won't come to the correct kind of I guess solutions for these issues. And I think that's something that we already talked about before about how capitalism in general, when it comes to its propagation and its existence within the superstructure, it often will kind of redirect and redirect these kind of criticisms or will be criticisms of itself into less helpful kind of means. So this is where the rise of social democracy and attempts to revive social democracy in America has kind of happened with the likes of Bernie and other individuals like that. So I don't believe that it's impossible for a revolution to happen in the U.S., but or like places like in the U.S. or Britain or something like that. But it is going to take a lot considerably because the exploitation that Americans and other people of in imperialist nations partake in, they can be blinded to it themselves. Like their consciousness can become obscured from it. So like I said, they have the wool kind of pulled over their eyes, and our job is going to be massively to take the wool off their eyes and kind of make them realize, kind of see the forest for the trees more or less.
Mm.
Yeah, exactly. I think a lot of what we do with this book is like we try not to talk about the contradictions within the US or within Europe as much as we do about contradictions within the global south. Because those contradictions are really like the contradictions that drive the world and determine its future, not like what goes on in Sweden or Denmark or America.
Absolutely, absolutely, and I think that is the most poignant part of capitalism, at least. Like that's where the crux of energy against capitalism is right now in the global south. Well, of course, we are seeing some growing within the global north too. I think the global south has a lot more of a highly developed one, especially like areas like the Red Corridor in India, or the CPP in the Philippines. Yeah, things like that. Finally, what's our Marxist materialist analysis of Trump? Like, what is he doing to America? Is he destroying it by mistake? Is it the ruling classes formalizing their power? Is it America eating itself? And what do we see happening after Trump? Will there be a reformist route, or will it just be more sort of this capitalist barbarity that they're currently doing, privatizing everything and just eating everything up?
All right, let me continue this. So essentially, when it comes to Trump, like we talked about earlier, really he himself, while he is a bit of an oddball, kind of, I think more or less likely that American empire will more likely kind of decline to a considerable degree by the end of Trump's term. Like we kind of see how American imperialism is kind of struggling along against other types of imperialism to kind of assert its dominance, like it was able to say at the beginning of the 21st century. Back when when the 21st century first started, we had the Bush presidency. America was like able to stand all kind of over the world and basically like be able to do whatever it wanted to. Whereas now, that's not always the case now, and you can kind of see like Trump's kind of antics where he wants to say, kind of annex Canada, or his approach to say the Ukrainian Russian war, or his approach to other geopolitical topics. I don't believe it's going to be the same. Things are going to be the exact same as they were before he came into there, because I do believe he's a bit more of an oddball. The war in Ukraine, as it kind of stands for right now, is kind of going in Russia's favor. They, of course, won't say that, of course, because even though Russia is like a counter imperialist power, or not a counter, but it's another imperialist power. A lot of the propaganda against Russia is often very, I think, it's both a racial as well as a kind of like um, dissuading characteristic. So you will see. I remember when the war actually first started, that there was always this big thing. Oh well, Russia's running out of gear, or Russia's running out of money, or they can't sustain the war. And then, but yet 4 or so years later, the war is still going on. International backlash against Israel is also kind of growing, but I really believe, like I said, we as communists really need to, especially in America, where there's a growing trend amongst younger people, especially, where people are kind of realizing like, hey, the stuff that's going on in Israel is not all that great, stuff like that. Like things are really bad there, and we saw the rise in protests and the like this year and last year in response to that. So I do believe those kind of trends will kind of keep continuing, but there's also more likely will incur some form of wrath from the state. Um, but Trump himself is kind of seeing these issues kind of going on, but he's still trying to kind of keep American capitalism afloat, at least in the way he can. Now, of course, it's not the most sane way possible, because he is a bit of I guess, a bit of a showman on the media. If you've ever seen him, like in his different interviews, stuff like that, you can definitely tell he has that kind of showman quality to him. But I think we think things will be a little bit different um, after Trump's presidency. Robert, you have anything to say?
Yeah, I think that Trump just revealed a lot of the underlying contradictions in the United States society that were masked by Joe Biden and liberalism. I think it was actually one of your quotes that exposed this. Hmm. Trump is the logical conclusion, the culmination of years of capitalist ideology and economy, and the existence of settler colonial states such as the United States of America, Israel, Australia, and the like. Individuals such as Lawrence Southern, Ben Shapiro, Candace Owens, Mike Enoch, Jordan Peterson, and Gavin McInnes are the result of capitalism's inherent contradictions seeking to be resolved in the most reactionary of ways. I think he's just revealing the hypocrisy of liberalism and conservatism. Unmasking it is the brutal and oppressive system that it is.
Mm, I really like that quote because a lot of people want to act like Trump is a new phenomenon, but he's really not. He is, I mean, essentially his policies are just classic neoliberalism that's been going on since Reagan. It's just turned up a little bit to a notch, and then also it's very out there in the open. It's not hidden. Whereas I think Democrats are very good at hiding it. Sort of like in a frog in a boiling pot of water style, where people don't even realize they're being cooked. Trump very openly admits that we're being cooked. Um, I also think that, the American ruling elites, if they were smart, they would offer social democracy, but either they're unable to because of like an increasingly falling rate of profit, or they're just simply so inbred and sort of like in such a crisis of leadership since, I mean, nepo baby after nepo baby after nepo baby has been sort of put into power, that they're completely unwilling to give it up, and they're so hungry for money, and it's such a self-repeating cycle that they're not willing to get themselves taxed whatsoever to allow whatever social democracy that could be possible, that could fundamentally stabilize the system. So I honestly, in my opinion, I see after Trump just a formalization of his theft, right? His tax breaks are going to stay, his funding of ICE is going to stay, and perhaps there's going to be some stabilization under a Democratic presidency, but the major war against the working class is going to maintain. If you guys want to add anything.
Yes, I do believe, especially, and this kind of points back to the trend of younger people, people of our generation. I do believe that we will see the system more so for what it is compared to people who are older. Because if you look at the composition of a lot of people in, like to say, the Los Angeles protests and stuff like that, and the anti-ICE protests, a lot of it are younger people. So I do believe there is a good bit of hope in terms of how people are kind of seeing, the forest for the trees. They're seeing how the system is working out underneath Trump, especially, and they'll kind of they're going to, kind of want to rebel or want to go against that system. The only issue is, like I said, I think we talked about this earlier, is that how if it does come to happen that 4 or so years from now on, we get another Democrat president, hopefully the idea will be that we can maintain this momentum and kind of make people see like, okay, well, just because Trump's going away doesn't mean these issues go away. Those issues are still there. He just, like, essentially the issues are still there. He's just a transparent piece of glass that's been put over them. But like, a Democrat, just because a Democrat goes over them, that doesn't mean that they're completely resolving the issues. They're just like an opaque piece of glass being put over it. The issues are still there. It's just that they're being exterior more. So we need to keep combating those issues. Otherwise, if we don't continue to combat those issues, 4 years from now, I mean, or 4 years after whatever hypothetical Democrat president gets elected, we could see another Trump. Probably not Trump himself, but someone else who kind of represents Trump. Some people maybe expect like a Stephen Miller type or someone like that. Depending on how conditions go, it might be more extreme than Trump himself. So it just kind of depends on how things kind of go on. But the big thing is, things are looking somewhat up. Like I said, more young people, especially of our generation, are seeing things that are going on, and hopefully we don't have a repeat of 26, not 2016, but 2020 and 2016, where people saw the issues, but they thought, okay, let's put a Democrat in there and everything will be resolved.
Absolutely. I do think to some extent Trump is such a character where he's so charismatic and able to unite all these disparate groups within the right and the Republican Party, where he almost is. I mean, going past a Marxist analysis, he almost does seem to me sort of like a world historical figure in that old Hegelian sense. Where I think the right is really going to struggle. Personally, I do think they're really going to struggle to find another Trump who's able to unite the right in such a way that he was. Unless you guys disagree.
I do remember that when Trump was initially elected back in 2016, there was kind of a split. But I think that as Trump continues to push for the policies that are typically associated with the Republican Party, that there might actually be more of a consolation that there won't be as much of a rebellion against him as there was during his first term, and that as time goes on, I think that more and more people will kind of go behind him. That's not like a Democrat, but I do believe that I do agree that he is kind of centralizing the Republican Party more or less to get behind him because he doesn't seem as different. Maybe it's because he doesn't seem as different as he was back then, or maybe it's just because the policies he are passing are policies that the Republican Party in general kind of wants, or like not the Republican Party, but more like the bourgeoisie as a class kind of want. Because I don't think that they really want social democracy. Well, it's not that I don't think they don't want social democracy, and I think that part of the reason why they aren't pushing forward is because they don't feel a necessity. Maybe because the working class's power in the U.S. isn't as high as it needs to be in order to push for those policies, which is probably why they were able to, despite the fact that there was a lot of organization around, say, Bernie Sanders, none of it was really militant. So because of that, once Bernie was kind of like Bernie himself was very easy to concede, to Joe Biden and to Kamala and stuff like that. And because of that, there's nothing tethering them to that. So unless we workers get like an actual like massive bump in terms of power and representation to where we actually do seem threatening, I think that's the only time the bourgeoisie would really be tempted to implement social democracy. But until that point in time, they're kind of going to keep chipping away at it, as we see in other countries with the neoliberal austerity, stuff like that. That kind of neoliberalism is going to keep going on until infinitum, until the policies are completely gone away from. As you see with Trump, where he's like completely like revamping Medicare and stuff like that to a negative degree, and kind of getting rid of all those provisions and stuff like that, making it a lot harder to have access to whatever medical care we can have.
Hmm. But do you think the right will struggle to find another figure as charismatic and uniting as Trump? Like will they be unable to recreate another Trump-like figure, or can they find one?
I,
Don't think that they would be able to find one. We've
yeah.
seen a lot of like people on the right, like DeSantis or even JD Vance, try to copy Trump and then just get absolutely ridiculed by Trump himself and the voters for doing so. Maybe someone new is going to come up, but they would have to rebuild themselves, reset the foundation. Like just like Trump did in 2016, it would take time to rekindle that movement. It wouldn't just continue on from the day Trump retires.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, guys, thank you so much for coming on. Has the book released yet?
Tomorrow. It'll
Tomorrow.
be up
Okay.
by the time this episode is up.
Oh yeah, easily. Let the people know where to find you guys, where to find the book, where to find your website, and let us know if you have any final words. Just any exiting words as for ending the podcast.
All right. Yeah. Maoism for the Masses. You can find us at maoismforthemasses.wordpress.com. I hope I don't have to spell that all out. It's just Maoism
Include it in the description.
Yeah. You can find us on Twitter at Maoist Masses. You can find us on Quora at maoismforthemasses.quora.com. You can join our Discord server. I believe there's a link to that on the website and maybe in the description too. And this book is going to be available on our website and also some platforms like Kindle or Google Books. So we are excited to share it with you all.
Cool. And Full Metal Mouse, you got any final words?
Yes, of course. Always listen to Robbie's links in the description. So we have, like I said, we do have a Twitter. We have a Reddit that's somewhat there, but we're trying to develop that. We also have, we are on Quora and we are on Discord. So of course, always feel free to join any of one of those most social media platforms. If of course you have any questions for us, or you're generally new to Marxism and you have questions, we're more than happy to give you any sort of advice, tidbits, anything like that. We can always give you. Fundamentally, of course, when it comes to Marxism, the best place to get the kind of ideas of Marxism is, of course, the source itself. So, like I said, I'm going to say the same thing I did at the beginning of the book, beginning of the podcast, rather. Read theory. It is very important, just not only as a kind of like understanding Marxism, but it helps you understand things as a whole. Like, trust me when I say this, you'll see things in an entirely new light, and you'll feel quite different than the typical liberal world once you kind of are able to see how things for how they truly are. So, yep, definitely keep your eyes and ears open to everything that's kind of going on in the world. And yeah, like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We're more than happy to help you.
All right, guys. Thank you so much for coming on. As always, the links will be included in the description. And you guys have a good one.
You too. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
This episode of the Pokepreet Pod has been brought to you by our generous members on our Patreon. If you'd like to become one of them, go to patreon.com/thepokepreetpod. Thank you. What the fuck? Glory to Stalin. I barely made it.